I'm not going to attempt to read my paper, which, as you those of you who've read it know, is far too long to be a paper of 40 minutes length. The paper is called, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize certain parts of it and extend other parts, and in particular the paper is mostly about ethics. I'm going to try to pull it somewhat into the metaphysics zone so that I'm in contact with some of the other metaphysics papers that we've heard. So here's where I'd like to start. I would like to start with the following question, which I understand is a common question, but I also find personally to be an annoying question. It's the question, is the Bible about obedience to God's commands? I mean, it's only annoying to me that we actually have to ask that question. The reason I find it troubling is because almost everywhere you look, certainly in academia, the answer to that seems to be simply yes. Up until very recently, I mean, I think up until 20 years ago, when a small, hardy band of Bible scholars started trying to chip away at this, for at least 100 years, as far as I know, every single book that was published on the question of the ethics of Hebrew Scripture said that the essence of Hebrew Scripture, sometimes just its ethics and sometimes just its essence entirely, is obedience. There's also, that's in the field of Bible studies. In philosophy, there's also a spin-off of this way of looking at the Tanakh, which is called divine command ethics. Divine command ethics is a prominent position within contemporary Christian philosophy, and it too assumes that the thing that we need to be taking away from biblical religion is that one should obey God's commands, and that's the definition of ethics. And in fact, it's such a common thing that if you pick up introductory works in philosophy, for example, there's a brand new ultra updated introduction to philosophical ethics by John Day that just came out with Cambridge University Press, and he has exactly the same thing to say. I mean, what's great about Day's book is that it's the first one that I've seen that actually says that philosophy is in some sense descended from the Hebrew Bible, but he has exactly one thing to say about that, which is that deontological ethics, Kantian ethics and ethics of that kind, he says, are descended from the law of Moses, whose teaching is that there's a universal God and he commands and you should obey, and that's the nature of ethics. Now, I really think that it's hard to imagine something that could be farther from the truth. And the only reason I believe that people are saying this is, at least certainly with such frequency and intensity, is because of the sort of Lutheran Protestant background of Bible studies and of the study of philosophy in the universities. It's true that most of us today who are heirs to that tradition we're not ourselves Lutherans, but to a pretty remarkable degree, the history of both philosophical and religious thought is handed down from the German universities where this stuff was originally discussed, and it just hasn't been challenged seriously. So I'd like to participate in the challenging of it seriously, I hope. And my claim is going to be that the claim in the paper, and I'll elaborate on it here, is that far from being about obedience, the Hebrew Scriptures in general are to a much greater degree about disobedience. Okay, now, I understand that that's counterintuitive for various reasons. The most obvious reason is that hundreds, thousands of times in the various texts in the history from in the history of Israel from Genesis to Kings, in the prophetic writings and so on, and even in Psalms and in Proverbs. We're told to give heed to God's word, to implement, to do, to follow, to I'm only not going to use obey because of a quibble about translations, but obey, fine. To obey the laws. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of places where the laws are in various ways described to us, the law of Moses, as that which is going to bring us life, that which is going to bring us flourishing. If we fail to do them, it's going to bring us death and destruction and exile of all sorts of different kinds. Just as a parenthetical note, I don't understand how that leads to a deontological ethics, but we can talk about that later if Ken is interested in helping me with that. But certainly the Bible is filled, it's lush, it's lavishly endowed with Moses and later prophets telling us that we really ought to obey the laws. Nevertheless, that's not what the Bible is about. The Bible has a lot of law in it, and has a lot of exhortations to obey the law. And I don't have any doubt that the people who were involved in writing it thought that if you obeyed the law, that would be really good. At the same time, they append. Now, be careful about my word choice. The law of Moses is not a standalone law. I mean, we know what standalone legal codes look like from the Middle East. There are all sorts of legal codes in the Middle East. There are lists of laws that begin with some kind of preamble, or sometimes there's a postamble, and the preamble always said, explains what it is that the king is doing in promulgating this law, and it's usually invoking some kind of God who is involved in one way or another. Maybe the king is the God if it's Egypt. Maybe he's the son of the God if it's Mesopotamia. But in any case, there's some kind of an explanation as to what this is about. Also, very often, laws could be attached to covenants among nations or between kings, so that the preamble might involve a description of why it is that one king is entering into a subordinate alliance with another king and therefore creating a covenant. And that's it. As far as I know, there's absolutely nothing in the ancient Middle East, and if I'm not an expert in this, if others are more expert, I would be happy to be corrected and to fine-tune my understanding on the subject. But as far as I understand, there's absolutely nothing in the Middle East that looks like what we have, which is a historical document, something that purports to be a history of a people that actually begins with the founding of the universe, of the world as we know it, and goes on to describe the rise of mankind and then the rise of a certain people, and then embeds the law within as sort of like a something that punctuates at certain periods this extraordinary historical narrative. Okay, the law of Israel is, it may historically, prior to the assembly of this history, probably in the wake of the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. That's probably when this thing was assembled. I don't think we know very accurately, but prior to that, there may have been all sorts of versions of the law of Moses, or versions of different parts of the law of Moses. There's absolutely no way to know this for sure, but there may have been. But the thing that we have is not a law code. The thing that we have is this extraordinary history, which embeds, which tells story after story about individuals and about nations, and embeds the law within that. And the problem is that those stories are, to say it gently, are not obedience-oriented stories. They're not about obedience. I mean, if this were just about obedience, then we'd have story after story of authority figures coming and saying, you should really obey, and good people saying, "Why, yes, I will," and all sorts of good things happening because of obedience. Maybe there are some stories like that, but not many. Most of the stories, most of the most exciting stories, the biggest heroes, both the grand ones and the little ones, are people who are disobeying all the time. This is not in my paper. I wrote an article about it once. A version of it is in my book on Esther, which is, again, the whole book of Esther is pivots around disobedience to various laws. So if people are interested in this subject, I can recommend my book and the chapters on disobedience there. But just in a nutshell, the kinds of people that are lauded in Hebrew scripture are people like the people like the midwives who Pharaoh says go out and kill the Hebrew children, and they say, well, that doesn't seem like a really good idea, and they start lying and they start maneuvering and they get out of it. And people like the Levite man and the Levite woman who disobeyed the law to hide their child Moses. And people like Moses, who when he appears on the scene, the very first thing he does is he sees injustice, so he starts killing people. Right? He grew up in the palace, leaves the palace, goes out among his brothers, sees injustice, so he starts killing. Okay? From there to the end of the Bible, where characters like Esther and Daniel are disobeying kings, there too. In fact, the entire salvation of Israel is the result of this series of disobediences to Egyptian law. The Bible is, on its face, chooses heroes who are just disobeying all the time, and it's hard to find places where any of them obey worldly rulers. So, of course, you can say, well, come on, Yoram, those are worldly rulers, but that's not the same thing as disobeying God. Right? Maybe the point of it is that you're supposed to disobey, people who do injustice in the world, or maybe people in the world more generally. But you're certainly not supposed to disobey God. But I disagree with that too. Certainly, the law of Moses is a law as it's presented as being that which brings good to us. So it's not really surprising that we see an awful lot of obeying it and people disobeying it and getting punished. But the interesting thing is that many of the most striking stories, sort of the stories that stand out as being shocking and dramatic and having something to say, are again, they're disobedience stories. So stories like, for example, we have this wonderful paper from Rosalind Weiss about Moses trying to get to know God after the sin of Chet Egel, of the golden calf. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. We'll wait for her paper. But that extremely dramatic story, which goes on for chapter after chapter, for really the entire end of the book of Exodus, is about a fight, a confrontation, a knockdown, drag-out fight between Moses and God, which involves not just Moses arguing with God, although he does that, but also involves his threatening God. If you punish the Jews for this, if you wipe them out like you say you're going to do, then I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I'm not going to take part in this. He threatens God a couple of times. And then there's a sit-down strike where God directly orders Moses twice, get up and take this people, take your people. He says, get up, take this people, and get them up to the land like I told you to. And Moses refuses. Right? And I'm not sure that there's any other place where there's anything quite this striking, but it's the climax of the book of Exodus. It's no small thing. And there's chapters devoted to it. The climax is that God gives Moses a direct order, and Moses refuses. And he says, I will not go up from here unless you forgive and bring your panim, come to be bring your presence into the camp. And then the rest of the end of the book of Exodus is that God relents and his presence comes into the camp, and only then do they begin moving. There's all sorts of other examples. I'll just touch on them. That's the most dramatic one. But we have Aaron, whose sons are killed, and who refuses to eat the korban according to the commandment because his sons have been killed. He's basically in a sit-down strike, and we're explicitly told that Moses thought that what he did was the right thing. We have Pinchas, who sees injustice, or not injustice, really moral corruption, let's say. We have Pinchas, who says, well, it's true, we've heard all of these laws about how we're supposed to have courts and we're supposed to have witnesses. I have a better idea. I'm going to take a spear and I'm going to impale these people, and then we're going to have justice. Right now, it's a complicated story because it's true that the Levites, don't end up getting, territory, and they don't end up getting to be part of the government. And it may be in part because they're people like Pinchas and they like taking justice into their own hands, and you shouldn't let people like that rule. Maybe. I think that that's a good reading. But the simplest reading is he picks up a spear, he impales it, and God likes it, and he gives him a reward. Okay? Let's take Bnot Tzlofchad as the daughters of Tzlofchad is another interesting example. God gives a law, and they say, but this law is unjust. It's unfair. We don't think we should live like this. And they appeal, and they get God to change the law. Okay, and you can sort of go on and on. The really interesting things going on in these narratives are very often not just resistance to human rulers and unjust people. Often enough, they're people who are fighting with and resisting and even disobeying and even refusing to obey and trying to get laws changed. That's a crucial part of what's going on in these stories. Now, all of us are familiar with the tradition of arguing with God. Okay, there's a tradition of arguing with God which is appears over and over and over again in the Bible. The most famous one is Abraham over Sodom, telling God, how can you possibly kill the righteous with the wicked? But there's a whole bunch of these. There's Jacob wrestling with the angel. There's about which more in a moment. There's Moses and Aaron arguing with God repeatedly. I haven't yet counted, but I think there's at least there's probably something like half a dozen different occasions where Moses and Aaron argue with God and try to talk him out of something and usually succeed. There's examples in Jeremiah, in Habakkuk. Of course, Jonah is an example of getting a command and resisting God because Jonah thinks that God is doing the wrong thing. I mean, he's got a pretty serious argument with God. He thinks that God is simply not running the world in the right way, and that's the reason that he's running away. And of course, there's also a famous example of this in Eov and Job. And there's more. There's Gideon having the angel appear to him, and the angel says to him, "Fear not, God is with you." And he says, "What are you talking about? God is not with us." His response to God is, "You've got to be joking. If God were with us, things wouldn't look like this. So God's not with us." This is a hero of Israel talking to the God who created the world. David, there's a story of David's where David gets angry about this. God keeps killing people who touches, who touches stuff. Like if you no, seriously, you touched my box and bam, and they're dead. So, but David is king in Israel, and he can't deal with this. So when the ark is being brought back to Jerusalem, and it wobbles, and for apparently completely reasonable reasons, Uzzah reaches to steady the ark to prevent it from falling, and God kills him for touching the thing. And David, who can't deal with this, he gets angry. He gets angry, and he says, "Well, if this is what it's like, this thing is staying here. It's not coming to Jerusalem." And the thing stays there, they're on the highway in somebody's house until God starts behaving himself. And only when, no, it's you don't have to accept it, but I think after you read the fight with Moses, between Moses and God, where Moses does exactly the same tactic, the sit-down strike. I will not go up. I won't do what you want me to do unless you give in, and God gives in. I read that story with David as simply an imitation of Moses. God has to give in order for the ark to get there. In any case, we can argue, as some of us will, about some of the examples. But these stories are not obedience stories. Even just getting angry at God is not an obedience story. And so the question is, what are all these disobedience stories, hundreds of them, what are they doing in this book that's supposed to be about obedience? And the simple answer is that I think the simple answer is that the law isn't enough, that telling people to obey the law simply isn't enough. Now, we can take that to all sorts of different levels. I want to try to push it. There is a political level and there's an ethical level. I want to try to push this to, as I said before, to the metaphysical level. The ethics is pretty well discussed in my paper. At the metaphysical level, I think that we have to give up on the idea, and I will say this slowly and carefully so as not to misspeak. We have to give up on the idea that what is described in these narratives is a perfect being. Right? I don't see any evidence. I'm not the first person to say this, but maybe one of the loudest. I don't see any evidence that the biblical narratives in which the law is embedded are talking about a perfect being. I don't see any evidence that God is all-powerful. Okay? In fact, I think that if we were to set aside Xenophanes and Parmenides and Plato's Timaeus and the medieval tradition, which keeps asserting that to be a monotheist is to believe in a perfect God. If we did not have this Greek tradition hanging over our heads and the medievals who canonized it, then I think that going back to read the Tanakh and probably the Talmud as well, would never have yielded a view that God is perfect. And so one of the and here I'm in immense sympathy with Drew's paper about the problem for us philosophically of we have to set aside these structures if we're interested. That is, if we're interested in what the Tanakh actually has to say, what it was trying to teach, then we have to set these structures aside and we have to go back to what it actually says and we have to ask, what does it say? So let me give you an example of something that I think it does say. The covenant, all right, which Len discussed so eloquently last night. The covenant is one of the explanations. There's actually also a natural law explanation. Maybe if I have time, I'll get to that. But the covenant is clearly one of the explanations for where the law comes from. All right, and the covenant is not all of these things, right? The covenant is based on a metaphor, the metaphor that God is a king, which later becomes the metaphor of a marriage. There's two different covenant metaphors. There's the God is king, and we're his subjects. We're a subject king, making a covenant with him. And then there's another version of it, which is the marital covenant. The marital covenant is God is the husband, and we are the bride. Now, the covenant is not a perfect being kind of an arrangement. A perfect being, as many people have said recently, including Rav Soloveitchik, Eliezer Berkovitz, I think Heschel says the same thing. Many people have said this. If God is a perfect being, then he has no need of a covenant. Because a perfect being is all-powerful. And all-powerful, all-knowing, all this, all that. A perfect being has no need whatsoever, right? In the medieval parlance, he has no privation. He has no fault. He has no need whatsoever to go about engaging in covenants with people. Why does God enter into covenants in the Tanakh? God enters into covenants in the Tanakh because he can't achieve the creation of the world that he's trying to achieve. Right? I'm asserting this, but I think that if you go through all of the stories of God's failure, right? This is the famous comment of Buber that the history of Israel and the Tanakh is the history of God's failures, and that's really true. What we have is over and over again a God who wants to do good, who wants a good world, who tries to set it up one way after another, and man keeps preventing him from being able to do it. Now, this God hurts. All right, he hurts. He's in pain. He's described in emotional colors as regretting and being in pain over his failures, over the fact that mankind, that he keeps reaching a hand to mankind and mankind rejects him. In the prophets, this image of God's pain is turned up to such an extraordinary, such a stunning level of pain that I'm not familiar with anything else in literature. Not that I'm such a big expert in literature, but that compares with the descriptions of Jeremiah or Ezekiel when they say, okay, forget about God as king, right? This big king. God's not a king. God's a husband. God's a husband, and he had a young wife, and he loved his young wife, and he went with his wife through all manner of hardship. How does it go? Bamidbar ve'eretz lo zruah, right? Those images of the young wife who then begins to go with other men, right? To sleep with all sorts of other men, right? Those images, those extraordinarily detailed images, are not images of an all-powerful being. They're images of somebody who's vulnerable. They're images of somebody who is almost powerless. The husband's stronger than his wife, right? But what is he going to do? Beat her? I mean, it doesn't help. You can do anything no, but that's the point. The point is that it doesn't make any difference that God is stronger than we are. Right? There's nothing you can do to make her do what you want her to do. There's nothing that God can do to make us do what we want. If he doesn't have our will, our want, our desire to be a part of what he wants, then he's got nothing. Okay, now that's the covenant. If you don't have that, if you don't have the assumption of a God who is vulnerable, who turns to Abraham and says, I need you because my world is aflame. I need you because my world is immersed in evil. I need you. You come to me and you join me. You make a covenant. Like, okay, I'm the big king, but you're a little king, as Josh Berman says in his really nice book on the subject. I'm the king and you're going to be a little king. You're going to be on my side. You're going to be my ally, not my subject. That's the meaning of covenant, that you're my ally, not my subject. I'm much stronger, but you're on my side. You're joining my side. Okay, now that entire structure, which I think I think you simply can't understand Tanakh if you can't understand covenant, and that's what covenant is about. And covenant makes no sense if God is all powerful. If God is perfect, it makes no sense. Now, I'm setting this up in order to be able to reach for what it is that makes God love people, certain people. Okay, and there's a lot of examples in the paper I gave you, but I want to read you just the first one, which is the story of Cain and Hevel. And let's look at how it is that God comes to love Abel. Okay, so there's the sin, there's the disobedience. Adam eats the Eve eats the apple, and Adam eats the apple, and God gets really angry, and he throws them out of paradise. And he says the following: "Uladam amar, ki shamata lekol ishtecha v'tochal min ha'etz asher tziviticha lemor lo tochal mimeno." And he said to the man, because you listened to your wife and you ate from the tree that I told you not to eat from, Arura adama ba'avurcha. The ground is cursed for you. Be'itzavon tochelna. From out of hardship will you eat from it. Kol yemei chayecha. V'kotz v'dardar tatzmiach lach. And thorns and thistles are going to come out of the earth, right? This is, it used to be Eden. It used to be you could just, reach up and grab any fruit almost that you wanted. And now kotz v'dardar tatzmiach lach. The earth, this is our lives they're talking about here. To be able to survive, what you're going to get is thorns and thistles. V'achalta et esef hasadeh, and you're going to eat, the grasses. That's what you're going to have to eat. V'ze'at apecha tochal lechem, and by sweating and slaving, you're going to be able to scrape out a little bit of bread. Ad shufcha el adama ki mimena lukachta ki afarata, until you return to the earth, to the soil from which you were taken. This is grinding somebody down. This is saying you're worthless. You're nothing. You lived because of me, because of what I gave you. Right? Because of what I gave you Gan Eden. Now you think you can do without me? You think that you can just disobey? You can make the decisions here? All right, fine. You make the decisions and see how far you can get on this cursed soil. V'shalcheu Adonai Elohim migan Eden, and he sent them out from the Garden of Eden. And listen closely. Lavod et adama asher lukach misham. He sent them out to work the soil from which Adam was taken, or lavod, as Menachem pointed out to me. Lavod et adama is also to serve it. So there's also a connotation, like a ring here, a little bit of, instead of serving me, why don't you try serving the soil? But you don't have to go that far. Bad enough as it is. You go work the soil, right? That's God's new plan for you. So Adam goes out and he works the soil. And then he has 2 children. And here's what we're told about them, right? The first thing we're told after we hear their names, Vayihi hevel ro'eh tzon v'kain haya le'oved adama. Adam has 2 children, and I take this to be an archetype that then repeats itself, ramifies over and over and over again through the history of Israel and through the Bible. There's 2 children, there's 2 sons, and one of them Abel became a shepherd, and one of them worked the soil. Now, we just read, not 3 verses ago, that God sends Adam out of the Garden of Eden to work the soil from which he was taken. And there's 2 sons, and one of them says, okay, God said so I'm going to do that. And the other says, work the cursed soil, thorns and thistles, sweat of my brow. And mind you, this guy isn't even Jewish. What? I'm not going to work the soil. I'm going to, sheep, goats, you go, goats, sheep, you go work the soil. You do the soil working. I'll sit here with my stick. If a bear comes along, then I'll fight that. Right? I mean, there's a sort of a remarkable decision that's made here on the part of Abel, and that is, my self-interest, that of my family. You could say, if you want to, it's an archetype. You can say future generations even. It depends on my, being a little bit creative here. But if you want to say creative, you could also say impious. As they teach us in yeshivas, and a lot of the commentators emphasize, it's not Abel who comes up with the idea of sacrificing to God. It's Cain. Right? The next thing that happens, Vehi miketz yamim yavo Cain ve'yavi Cain mipnei adama mincha l'Adonai. And then as far as Abel, ve'hevel levi gam hu miprorot tzono u'michalvein. Right? Cain is the guy who says, God sent me here to this wretched place. I live the life of an animal. I'm cursed. And it's not even because of me. It's because of my father's sin. And Cain is the guy who stands for obeying. He obeys the commandment that God commanded. He's the one who stands for piety. He's the one who says, All right, so God has cursed me, but you know what? I'm thankful anyway. I'm thankful for what I have. You know, I have my life. I'm alive. I'm thankful for this soil. Maybe it's cursed, but I have food. And from what little he is able to scrape out by the sweat of his brow, he takes from that and he says, I'm grateful enough. I'm going to give that to God. He invents gratitude to God. Right, that's certainly not from his father. Remember, his father says, the woman that you gave me this apple. Right. This is Cain. Cain is the guy who invents piety, and piety also towards his father. The farmer. Cain the farmer, who goes on to found the first city, is an archetype that throughout the entire Bible we're familiar with these societies. This is Mesopotamia. This is Egypt. These are societies which are all about obeying what the king and the gods tell you. You obey. Piety, sacrificing in order to be able to thank the gods for the life that you have. And piety towards your parents, going into your father's business. Sorry, wasn't originally Jewish, was Egyptian. Doing what your ancestors did, that's the basis of these vast, wealthy agrarian societies. That is what the Bible is coming out against when Abraham leaves Mesopotamia and Egypt and goes and becomes a shepherd. Cain is the one who represents obedience and piety. Abel does sacrifice, and not only that, but he gives good stuff too. But Abel's sacrifice is not the first thing on his mind. By the way, Abraham is a lot like this too. Abel's sacrifice is something that comes only after he sees that the farmer, the obedient one, the pious one, is sacrificing. Abel's interest is advancing mankind. And the fact that God chooses Abel, right, sends a message that resounds all the way through the rest of the story. I wrote about this at some length in my paper. I'll just touch on it in a second. Shepherds are not just something that the Jews happen to be. The shepherd story, Abraham leaving Mesopotamia to become a shepherd, right, leaving agrarian society to become a shepherd. Jacob leaving Mesopotamia to strike out on his own and continue to be a shepherd. Moses leaving Egypt in order to go become a shepherd, and many other examples. Right? This is the way that the Bible talks to us about this particular argument, the argument between being obedient and pious and doing what you think God is saying to you to do right now, and being a little disobedient. Jews say chutzpahdik, to dare to pit yourself against God's will. You know, maybe not head on, maybe sideways. Maybe you say, well, the commandment was to Adam, it wasn't to my father, it wasn't to me. Maybe he's sitting there saying to himself, it's a little bit like working, it's a little like, whatever it is, it's not what it was that Adam was told to do. And that constant searching for a way to improve my station and my family's station and ultimately that of my nation, and to do things that God in the end will say, you know what? I didn't expect this. Right? And please, I urge you, when you read the Tanakh, I urge you, when you read these stories, leave open, just forget this business about God being all-knowing. Leave open the possibility that God didn't expect things, and you'll be shocked to see how much comes to life. Over and over again, God doesn't expect things. Over and over again, man surprises him for evil and for good, because he doesn't have this perfect foreknowledge of all things. Over and over, he's surprised. And in this story of Cain and Abel, we have the archetype. We have the archetype of someone who says, I can do better than what God told me. Not I'm violating the laws because I lust for. Oh, thank you. Not I'm violating the laws because I've a lust for gold. I don't have enough gold. There's all sorts of ways you can violate the laws. Tons of ways you can violate the laws, and God will correctly think that you're dirt and you deserve to go back to the soil from which you came. But don't look at that. I mean, look at that, but look also at the ways in which God says over and over again, I didn't expect that. I didn't know I wanted that. I thought what I wanted was for them to go and suffer and serve the soil. But actually, I want something else. What he wants is human beings who are able to stand up to him, who aren't afraid, and who are able to argue with him and say, there's actually a higher standard of good. All right, now this higher standard of good business, I understand that it's very difficult for people of a certain kind of religious background. I understand it's very difficult. For example, Eleanor's book and I told her this. I think I think probably to many Jews, but it's shocking the way she treats Abraham. When Abraham comes to argue with God about destroying Sodom, she says the foolishness of it, the presumptuousness. And no, really, she uses these words. She says, "What kind of a fool would think that an all-knowing, all-powerful God, who's all good, needs his advice?" Right? The chutzpah, the impudence of it. And after I read what she wrote, I went back, and I've been reading this story my whole life, and I went back and I just to see, is she right? And she's right. Listen to the Hebrew. Chalila lecha ma'asot kadavar hazeh. Chalila, I don't know how to translate that. God forbid. Right? Horrific that you should. What? You, God, you're going to do something like that? Lahamit tzadikim rasha, to put the righteous to death with the wicked. It gets worse. Vayaket tzadik rasha, chalil lecha. In your eyes, has the righteous turned into the same as the evildoer? I mean, that's really, like over the line. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yashem mishpat. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? All right, look, she's right. This is not over the line. This is over. Just draw several more lines past the line, and it's over all of those too. And God loves this. God loves this because God needs this. Right? That's what's in this story. That God loves Abraham out of all the people in the world. Not because he stands up to him. Lots of people stand up to him, but they stand up to him for evil. Here's a person who stands up to him because he says, no, what I've inherited from you, what you're doing isn't good enough, and I think I can make it better. Now, when you take all of these stories, this wrestling with God, which in the end becomes the name of the people Israel, right? Jacob, who begins out being as Ed Greenstein calls him, Jacob the conniver, right? The word Yaakov, right? From the trickster, the conniver. Jacob, in the end, when he wrestles the angel, and God says to him, your name's not going to be Jacob anymore, it's going to be Israel, because you've wrestled with God and with men, and you've prevailed. Right? This is not some folk tale. Or at least not in the version we have it. This is not some folk tale. This is the key to the entire story. The key to the whole story is that God thinks that if you just have a whole bunch of pious people who just obey and do what they're told, then you're going to have Egypt, the house of bondage. You're going to have Mesopotamia. You're going to have a world of unchecked evil. Obedience and piety without anything else is a world of unchecked evil. And the characters in this story who are presented as having a shot at doing something to save this world are characters like Abel and Abraham and Jacob and Moses and David, the shepherds, the ones who are willing to fight what they've received. In the context of the law, right? This is let's call it a counterpoint. Of course we're supposed to obey the law. It's natural law. It's the thing that's supposed to bring life and good to the world. But that doesn't mean that everything that is said to be the law, that everything that we believe that God is saying at a given moment, that everything that God appears to us to think at a given moment, That that's what God would really want in the end if he could see to the end. And we're partners with him, junior partners, but partners who he loves. Yes, okay, I got it.